So today we're looking at chapter 2 of book 2, Auschwitz Time Flies, which opens with this really haunting graphic image of Jewish mice being burned at Auschwitz. So we'll get to that a little bit later as we go through the walkthrough. Now we're going to start today with the meta-narrative here. Now a meta-narrative is a story about another story. So this is the story about the writing of Maus itself. Now I've got this graph here, and excuse the poor drawing, but hopefully it visualises the way that the narrative threads throughout Maus are laid together, the structure of the different narratives. So first and foremost, we have the two main narratives. The present narrative, which takes place in the 1970s and really focuses on the relationship between Vladek and Art. Secondly, we've got this other narrative about the past, okay? Vladek and Anya's experiences during the Holocaust, during World War II. Now these form the main narratives in the novel. Outside of these, however, we have Prisoner from Hell Planet, which shows Anya and Art's relationship, and the meta-narrative that we're looking at the moment, which really focuses on Spiegelman. Okay, within the book, the character is Art, because it's Spiegelman writing about himself, so I tend to refer to him as Art. Now the character that we see in the meta-narrative, however, is firmly Spiegelman. In my opinion, it's definitely representative of the author himself talking about the creation of the text some years later. So it's kind of set during the mid-1980s. Now what this graph also visualises, I hope, is Art's concerns from the previous chapter, when he's complaining that there's so much that happened during the Holocaust, so much in his father's stories, that he has to distort and leave out when putting it all together in a book. Okay, so we only really see kind of small snippets of Vladek's life and Art's life, and they're all condensed in a certain way so that they fit within the story that we see in Maus itself, in the complete Maus. Now a number of visual elements indicate that this meta-narrative that we're looking at the moment falls outside of the main narratives. First of all, we see Spiegelman the author here, not Art the character. I think it's really important to draw the distinction between the two. Now some of the visual elements that I've got listed over here in the notes. We've got piles of bodies at the bottom of this panel here, alluding to the millions killed in the Holocaust and also representing Spiegelman's feelings about exploiting the suffering of his father and all those Jews during the Holocaust that died in order to make this book. We also have a lot of masks in this section here, and they kind of serve to conceal identities and simplify the really complex issues that we have throughout Maus, such as race and culture. We can clearly see that they're masks because they've got these little strings on the back. We've also got this swastika in the background of this scene behind Spiegelman. Now it definitely reminds us who's responsible for the Holocaust, okay, the Nazis. But you could also suggest that Spiegelman being seated in front of that swastika, having it kind of in the background, definitely creates some kind of link between the two. Now as this scene proceeds, we see Spiegelman shrinking from a man all the way down to a baby where he's crying down the bottom here. Now we see him shrinking obviously from the media, represented by these dudes in hats and the masks with the microphones, but he's also shrinking away from the Holocaust and all these thoughts of the Holocaust and kind of the insurmountable task of portraying that Holocaust in a comic book. So next up we have the panels with Pavel. Now Pavel is Spiegelman's psychiatrist, his shrink, and they spend a fair bit of time talking about his relationship with his father. The focus lies on the themes of luck and survival. So Pavel's breaking down Spiegelman's concept of his father in these scenes. It's really easy for us and for Art to think of Vladek's survival as being a result of his own resourcefulness, and we often see examples of this, him speaking languages, him thinking on his toes, all that kind of stuff. But Pavel reminds Art that life or death in the camps ultimately boiled down to luck more often than not. He's explaining to Art in these scenes here that people didn't survive because they were the best, but because they continuously got lucky rolls of the dice. Pavel has this fantastic quote here. Make sure you memorise this one, guys. Life always takes the side of life. He's saying that we tend to see life as winning, death as losing. But he says to Art, it wasn't the best people who survived, nor did the best ones die. It was random. Now I see this scene as really supporting the idea that luck was the ultimate decider of life or death in Auschwitz. Regardless of Vladek's resourcefulness that we see throughout the novel, anything could have gone wrong at any moment. He could have got caught, could have been found out. What Vladek's resourcefulness does do is slightly tip the odds in his favour. After his chat with Pavel, we see Spiegelman grow back up to adult. Okay, so he's feeling a little bit better now that he's had a chat. But then he goes back to the drawing board, and we see him listening to his father's memories again, listening to his father's story about Auschwitz. And we see him shrinking yet again as he's hearing about what his father went through, and just shrinking, comparing himself to those experiences. It's a lot of the smaller details that really reveal how shocking this experience is for Spiegelman. We see the jagged edges around the dialogue, suggesting, the abrupt nature of the information that Vladek's talking about. We see the little shock lines around Spiegelman's head. We see the shocked little eye here. And then finally we have a sigh. We also have suddenly the return of the capital letters, which serve as a bridging mechanism from the meta-narrative that we've seen here to the past narrative again, back to the main stories. Back in the camps, Vladek starts telling Art about Yiddle, okay? A Russian communist Jew that was also imprisoned in the camps. I think he's worth a mention, despite him not being a huge character, because he's a really great example, I think, of irony. Now, broadly speaking, and this is pretty broad, irony is when something represents the opposite of what it is seemingly meant to. Okay, so save the trees up here on all this cardboard that's been used to cut down the trees. Obviously not saving many trees. Regret nothing tattoo, spelled incorrectly. I think they're going to regret that. Well, how is Yiddle an ironic character then? What does that even mean to be an ironic character? First of all, you've kind of got to have some background knowledge of Judaism, communism, what was happening in Europe at the time. Now, some of the core concepts of communism, which was the predominant ideology in Russia at the time, it was the government ideology. Some of these core concepts are that everything in the community is shared, that everyone in the community contributes, and that everyone in the community is able to fulfill their needs, if not necessarily their wants, okay? So you may want something, but if you don't need it, that doesn't mean you get it, okay? Now, Yiddle carries the label of being a communist, but he hardly represents communism, okay? He hardly subscribes to any of those communist ideals that I just listed. This is even despite Yiddle talking the talk, having a shot at Vladek for being a factory owner and having exploited the workers in the past, calling him a dirty capitalist. Vladek describes Yiddle as follows down in the bottom right here. He was so greedy. He wanted I risk only for him. I too had to eat. This is ironic then, because he doesn't share, he doesn't contribute, and if he does so, it's only grudgingly. He's just had a go at Vladek for having been a factory owner and exploiting the workers. But now, Yiddle, in charge of the tinsmiths, frequently exploits his own workers and takes advantage of them to get more food, etc. One of the ways you might use a character like Yiddle in your essays is using him to discuss the theme of survival, because he puts survival before ideology, or even to discuss the animal metaphor, to show us how not all mice are really on the same side. Despite being Jewish, there are differences. This guy's Russian, Vladek's a Pole. Now, if we move on, we will come to one of my favourite panels in the novel. We meet the German Jew here. He's an old man who claims that he's German, saying his son is a soldier in the German army. But he is a prisoner here, and the Germans have classified him as Jewish. The two panels illustrate the problem of using animals to show the divisions within Europe at the time. The left panel depicts the man as a mouse, as a Jew, but the right panel depicts him possibly as a cat, possibly as a German. The shading, the murkiness you might say here, in this right panel, indicates the uncertainty and doubt surrounding the German Jew's claim. Vladek, discussing it in the present, isn't even sure. Below this we've got this panel where this man, regardless of whether he was a Jew, regardless of the fact that he might have been a German, he's getting beaten to death. Okay, it's showing that if you're a prisoner in this camp, regardless of where you were born, what you think you might be, what you personally identify as, this panel here is showing that the Germans are in control. The Nazis, the way they categorized you, that was what you were in this camp. If you were categorized as a Jew, you were a Jew. If you were categorized as a Pole, you were a Pole, and they treated you as such. Now, this scene is discussed at length in MetaMouse, so please check that out if you have a chance. Now, we're going to come back to this scene afterwards, and we're just going to go on to this part here where we meet Mancy for the first time. Now, her relationship with Anya is another example of how important connections with other people were in order to survive. The importance of relationships is what we're talking about here. Before the war, Anya was quite dependent on her family and on Vladek. Anya depends on Vladek and then Mancy throughout the war years. And then we see this dependency magnified in Anya's later years, as we can see in the Prisoner on the Hell Planet comic. Mancy appears later on in another chapter, so we'll probably come back to her at another stage. Now, another interesting scene from this chapter is this scene with Dr. Mengele. Mengele was the head physician at Auschwitz, meaning he decided who went to the gas chambers and who did not. A really good example of that theme of luck, that theme of chance, okay? Mengele is really notorious in history for the experiments he carried out on living human beings during the war at Auschwitz. He's a really, really horrific example of how Nazi ideology enabled people to explore the darker reaches of human experience. If you want to check out some of these experiments that he did, there's a fair bit of detail about them on places like Wikipedia and other areas of the internet. But let's keep ourselves restrained to mouse, at least for the time being. Now, in these panels here, these four, we see Vladek literally reenacting Mengele's commands in the middle of the park. So this one, and this one here are all in the present narrative. This one here, the fourth, however, is Vladek in the past narrative. Spiegelman uses a really interesting visual technique here to transition us from the present narrative back into the past. We literally use Vladek's turns to kind of circle us back in time, almost. Back to the monotonous violence in Auschwitz. Now, Vladek's brush with death is really put in perspective by this corner panel. What we're seeing here are the ones that had not so lucky. The SS wrote down their number and sent to the other side. Okay, so these are the ones that left Auschwitz through the chimneys, the ones that were murdered there. So let's move on to a little bit further on in the chapter. We've got a lot of stuff happening in this one, but I've just chosen to focus on a few things. And one I would like to focus on at this point is a kind of question that runs throughout Mouse. And that question is, how do we remember the past? On the one hand, Spiegelman's trying to show how the past actually happened according to the history books. Okay, so there's a great deal of effort put into accurately portraying what it looked like being in Auschwitz. This image of Vladek hiding on the toilets here, Spiegelman went to a huge amount of effort to figure out what these toilets actually looked like in order to show us an accurate representation or reconstruction of the past. On the other hand, however, he also wants to stay true to how his father remembers the past. Okay, because sometimes Vladek's memories don't line up with the history books. Two aspects of this problem are shown throughout this chapter using visual devices, and we're going to look at two of them right now. Firstly, let's skip back in the chapter a little bit. We are looking for the orchestra scene. Here we are, here, up on this page here. So, firstly, we've got the orchestra panels. Vladek's describing how he marched out to the camp each morning. The panel Spiegelman provides to illustrate this shows Vladek marching out the gate past an orchestra in the background. Now, Art already knows about this orchestra. It's really well documented. It's something you can look up on Wikipedia. There's plenty of information out there about it. And what we see here is him imposing his father's memory onto his own understanding of what the camp looked like. So Spiegelman makes the assumption that Vladek's memory fits with the history books, fits with this event of the orchestra being at the Auschwitz gates. But Vladek subsequently says he has no memory of such an orchestra. Even though it was there, it wasn't according to Vladek's memory. The next panel shows the group still exiting the camp a little further out the gate, so they've proceeded a little bit on the path. And the orchestra is obscured in the background. You can just see the tops of the instruments up here. This is kind of the author's way of showing that clash between the past as it is documented and the past as it is remembered. Now let's go back to the timeline that we saw earlier on. So this is the second visual kind of way of showing that conflict between the past as it's remembered and the past as it's documented. Now during this scene, Art is really trying to work out when and where Vladek spent his time in Auschwitz. And in order to visualise this process, Spiegelman includes this timeline at the edge of the page. Vladek's memories of what he was doing in Auschwitz and for how long do not match up with his previous retellings. Okay, so previous recordings don't match up with more recent ones. And we kind of need to ask, well, do we need to know exactly when different parts of Vladek's story happened? Does it really matter? So at the bottom of the timeline, Art is trying to work out how long Vladek was doing black work for. Yet we're ultimately left wondering. Francois' appearance and her little speech bubble there obscure the end of the timeline, leaving it ambiguous. We know he spent some time there, but in order for Art to stay true to his father's jumbled memory, he can't really cement the dates in stone. What this timeline really shows well, I think, is the author's attempts to maintain the integrity of his father's memory. The precise dates can't and perhaps shouldn't remain precise, because his memory is always going to be changing. Even if it happened on a certain day in a certain month in the past, that's not how it plays out in Vladek's memory. Throughout the complete mouse, Spiegelman's really trying to strike a balance. On the one hand, he's trying to show history as it happened. On the other hand, he's trying to show history as it's remembered by his father. And sometimes those two things don't quite gel. But that's where we have a massive advantage of something like a graphic novel. Spiegelman can use graphic devices like these in a graphic format to show us that these two ways of talking about the past aren't always aligned. So the next part of our video, we're going to talk about these images here and the map earlier on showing us what Auschwitz looks like. Generally, and I'm really generalising here I think, the present narrative uses very literal visual language. By this I mean each panel shows a moment of conversation or interaction. This is because these moments are ones Spiegelman has himself experienced, and they're quite relatable for the reader. Okay, we can imagine ourselves in Art's shoes, talking with our dads, talking with a family member. Imagining ourselves in a place like Auschwitz, however, is a completely different story. At times, in the present narrative, Art really struggles with understanding what happened in the past, and even just trying to imagine what it looked like. In the novel, he employs a kind of bridging technique, using visuals to connect what Vladek's saying about the past to the present, okay, and putting it in some kind of form that we can make sense of. Now, I'm going to try to explain why Art Spiegelman uses these kind of visual devices to show us and kind of demonstrate what his father's talking about and what their kind of purpose is. So I want you to imagine a man standing on one side of a river. This man is Art, okay, the author, and this side of the river is the present. Over here on the far bank we've got the past, okay, so this is what Vladek's talking about. Now Art's trying to understand what he sees on this other side of the river, what he sees over on the far bank. It kind of looks vaguely familiar, but he can't really see the details, okay, because it's something he's never seen before. He can't really define what it looks like in his mind. So, he grabs a pair of binoculars, a device that enables him to see more clearly, okay, or make more sense of what he's seeing on the other side of the river, what's happening in the past. Now let's go back to the graphic novel and see how Spiegelman is using devices in this chapter, how he's using his binoculars to really make sense of what his father's talking about, really. Some of the things Art struggles with are, for example, how far away were the two? Where was Anya located? Where was Vladek located? What kind of travel did Vladek have to make to reach Anya? Okay, so what kind of barrier, what kind of obstacles did he have to overcome? And this map really helps us visualize that. On this page we see Vladek and Art's conversation overlaid on top of the map, suggesting that Vladek's memories the information he provides is definitely the most important factor here. And the map serving as kind of a secondary role, okay, serving to support what Vladek is saying. The layout of the panels, okay, around the edges, even that is saying something. It's suggesting how their dialogue is revolving around this central topic of Auschwitz and what the camps and their layout actually looked like. Another part of this chapter that I kind of connect with that earlier map are the drawings of the crematoria buildings. Now, again, Vladek's describing them, okay, and it's in the foreground. His description is overlaid on top of these images, giving his interpretation of the past according to his memory. And in the background, we have diagrams, pictures drawn by Spiegelman, presumably after having done a fair bit of research into what these buildings looked like and having visited Auschwitz at a time when it was still really run down. Looking at this picture now, you could bring it back to that idea of balancing interpretations of the past according to Vladek's memories and interpretations of the past according to the history books. And what a scene like this kind of does is reconcile those two things, kind of unite them and balance them and show how we can use memory as well as the documented history to arrive at new meanings, arrive at new interpretations and understandings of what happened during this horrible event. One of the ways that I also interpret this chapter is in terms of the architectural details we see here. And those architectural details kind of being representative or reflective of the architecture of the Holocaust itself. So the Holocaust was this sprawling, planned out thing. Heaps of detail went into it. The Nazis were thinking about it well before the war even began. There were really high-profile meetings amongst Nazi officials about how this final solution would actually be carried out. And this really systematic method of the death camps was eventually settled on kind of ad hoc to some extent, but nevertheless, there was definitely some planning involved. You've got your showers down here. You've got a pretty systematic process to get those prisoners into the ovens. And if you ever get a prompt on your SAC or your exam that's asking you to talk about how Spiegelman uses graphic imagery to, evoke emotion or evoke something, I think a scene like this is a really great one to talk about because it's literally showing the Jewish victims of the Holocaust dismantling the machinery that carried out that Holocaust, dismantling the crematoria so that the Nazis, hopefully wouldn't get found out. We see here Nazi prisoners digging graves, okay, for the dead bodies that haven't been burned yet. And then as there are people in the graves working, other Jews being forced to burn them alive. Like, this is one of the most graphic images in the entire novel, I think, of Jewish prisoners burning alive. And we've got flames raging in the background. We've got kind of dead bodies already thrown into the graves and live bodies burning. And their mouths are open in pain, open in anguish. We don't often see the Jewish characters, the mice, with their mouths open. We very, very, very rarely see it. But those few times we do, it usually signifies something pretty important and really draws the reader's attention just because it's something that we don't see very often. And it almost sucks your attention kind of into the scene, into the soul of the character almost, I think. Now the last imagery in this chapter I want to look at is this section here where we see Art and Francois hanging out on the porch at night, and we've got some little flies buzzing around in the background. And Francois says here, "It's so peaceful here at night, it's almost impossible to believe Auschwitz ever happened." So Francois is not really fussed by the presence of these pests, we might say, buzzing about. but art is. And he says, but these damn bugs are eating me alive. Okay, and oh, me too, she says all of a sudden, even though earlier she said how peaceful she was. Okay, and art, carelessly as anything, pulls out the spray and exterminates these flies. Really without much thought, okay? His primary motivation was destroying something that he saw as a pest in order to make things a little bit happier for himself. Now this seems to me like a really simple kind of reflection of how events kind of unfolded during World War II, where we had some members of German society who weren't too bothered by the Jewish members of society, whereas we had a few which were pretty peeved off and really didn't want them there. Okay, so then some members of German society started saying, oh, we need to get rid of these pests, and the others kind of fell into step, and they started exterminating them, okay, killing them. I might be drawing the bow a little far on that one, I might not be, but any text is open to the reader's interpretation, even if the author didn't mean something a specific way. That doesn't put it off limits from you taking it to mean something, okay? Once that book is in your hands, you're the one making meaning with the words and the images on the pages. It's up to you to really interpret the messages that the author's trying to get across, and perhaps even reading into it the messages that the author might not be.